order always demands choices. It is defined by what it excludes as much as what it permits. Kissinger, in his work World Order, does not write about history as a closed current, but as a cracked painting where those fissures continue to spread, shaping the current century. He dissects civilizations, confrontations, and attempts to arrange the world into a structure that is both stable and fragile. This is not merely a story of power, but of order, something more delicate, yet decisive in every power game. So, in a world where every model of lauded order eventually shatters, does a common formula for stability still exist? Or is it chaos itself, to some extent, that forms the true foundation of global order? Chapter 1, Europe, the Pluralistic International Order. The history of most civilizations often revolves around the rise and fall of colossal empires, where what is called order typically relies on concentrated power. The stronger the empire, the more stable its borders. When central power wanes, chaos ensues. In China or the Islamic world, political disputes were simply struggles for control over an existing framework. Dynasties changed, but the fundamental model continued as if every emperor, every caliph, were merely a temporary repairman of an established system. But Europe was different. When the Roman Empire collapsed, no single power was strong enough to maintain a unified *pax Romana*. Fragmentation into multiple centers became its fundamental characteristic. Paradoxically, from this division, Europe gradually formed a new model of international order. With no single emperor, no single church powerful enough to dominate the entire continent, it was the balance among many smaller entities that created stability. Order was no longer the result of absolute power, but was maintained by mutual restraint. For centuries, Europe accepted living in a state of division as if it were natural. Dynasties, nations, and peoples contested, but simultaneously, implicitly held each other within limits, ensuring no single party could fully conquer the whole. This very inability to unify by force became an opportunity to form a new concept, order based on balance. The dissolution of Rome in 476 ushered in a period historians call the Dark Ages. But even in that darkness, the illusion of unity reappeared in a new form, the Church. People believed that Christendom was a unified society with two parallel branches of power, secular government and papal authority. In reality, that power was merely a framework. Inside were dozens of petty states and princes acting on their own, with constant warfare. In this context, there was a moment when it seemed Europe would re-establish unity. Christmas Day, 800. The Pope crowned Charlemagne, the Frankish king, transforming him into the Holy Roman Emperor. That image evoked an all-encompassing empire, an era of one god, one emperor. But that dream quickly faded. After Charlemagne's death, the empire was torn apart, fragmenting into many pieces. The title, Holy Roman Empire, remained, but real power was hollow. Voltaire sarcastically remarked that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. In the 16th century, Charles V of the Habsburg dynasty once again ignited the illusion of unity. He possessed territories spanning across Europe from Austria, Germany, and Italy to Spain, plus new colonies in the Americas. In the eyes of many, this was an opportunity to recreate a global order, a single shepherd for all humanity. But in reality, Charles could not sustain it as the Protestant Reformation spread, challenging the Church's authority. Meanwhile, neighboring states like France brazenly allied with the Islamic enemy to curb Habsburg power. The so-called global order collapsed in the very hands of its dreamer. Charles eventually abdicated, dividing his territories between his son and brother, abandoning the dream of unity, and retiring to a monastery. 3 more events marked the demise of the illusion of a unified Europe. First, the Age of Exploration. Maritime voyages took Europe beyond its familiar borders, transforming it into the center of a global game. Second, the invention of printing. Knowledge spread rapidly, challenging the Church's monopolistic power. And third, the Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther. The order based on religious unity was shattered, giving way to a Europe plunged into bloody conflict. These religious battles finally erupted into the catastrophe known as the 30 Years' War, 1618–1648. Central Europe was devastated. A quarter of its population was wiped out by war, famine, and disease. In theory, Catholic monarchs should have united against heresy. But in practice, France, a Catholic kingdom, chose to ally with Protestant princes as long as it could weaken the Habsburgs. In that world, faith was merely a cloak. Beneath it lay cold calculations of power. At the heart of these calculations was an exceptional figure, Cardinal Richelieu, France's chief minister. He did not view the state as the personal property of a monarch, nor as a tool to serve the church. Richelieu was the first to declare the state an independent entity, transcending family and religion. It thrived on raison d'etat * national interest. In the chaotic world of religious wars, he put this theory into practice. France sided with the Protestants, not out of faith, but for the balance of power. The 30 Years' War was a nightmare that reshaped Europe. Starting as a dispute over the Bohemian throne, it quickly escalated into a regional massacre. Central Europe was ravaged to the point where some areas saw their population halved. Violence no longer distinguished between soldiers and civilians. It was a period when people realized that without finding a new mechanism to limit power, Europe would self-destruct. Amidst that smoke and fire, Richelieu led France down an entirely new path. As a cardinal, he wore the red robes of the church, but in his political thought, he went against everything it stood for. He did not choose the Catholic side. Instead, he chose the interests of France. In Richelieu's eyes, a nation does not have an immortal soul to await salvation, it only has the present. And if it did not act immediately, it would be crushed. Therefore, he preferred to cooperate with heretics rather than allow a mighty empire to rise in Central Europe. This logic led France to oppose the Habsburgs, contributing to the formation of the concept of raison d'etat as the guiding principle of modern diplomacy. When all parties were exhausted, a new solution emerged, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Unlike previous treaties, which were always made in the name of religion or empire, this time, a completely pragmatic approach was chosen. Peace was concluded not through the unification of faith, but through the recognition of diversity. Each state had the right to determine its own political and religious structure, provided it did not interfere in the internal affairs of others. The principle of equality among states, large or small, was established for the first time. Westphalia did not create a superpower to dictate the rules of the game. It created a playing field where multiple powers coexisted and checked each other. People no longer dreamed of a single global order but accepted a multipolar world. And to maintain that world, a mechanism of balance of power was needed. If one state became too strong, the others would coalesce to restore the equilibrium. This system was quickly institutionalized: permanent ambassadors, international law, multilateral conferences. It was like an empty framework that could contain different contents, as long as all parties agreed not to break the frame. This very emptiness was its advantage. Anyone, any culture, could participate, provided they accepted the basic principles of sovereignty and equality. Of course, Westphalia did not prevent war, but it transformed wars from crusades with ambitions of total victory into more limited conflicts aimed at adjusting the balance. People fought to change borders or specific interests, no longer to completely annihilate opponents. Here, pragmatic calculation replaced fanaticism, but balance is not something that can be maintained once and for all. It is constantly shifting. Louis XIV of France is a testament to this. The Sun King concentrated unprecedented power, building Versailles as a colossal stage to flaunt his authority. The French army, the most powerful in Europe, constantly expanded. For a moment, it seemed he could break the Westphalian order to establish French hegemony, but the more he expanded, the more he caused other nations to ally against him. Ultimately, Louis's victories were temporary. What remained was the system of balance. The 18th century saw a new challenger, Prussia under Frederick the Great. Unlike Louis, he did not possess inherent strength. He had to forge it himself from a small kingdom with few people and resources. Frederick transformed the army into a steel machine, making discipline the national spirit. When he seized Silesia, a wealthy Austrian territory, he sent a chilling message: power, not morality, determines a nation's status. Prussia's adventure sparked a chain of alliances and counter-alliances, ultimately leading to the 7 Years' War. In that chaos, even Russia was drawn in, participating for the first time in the European balance game. Frederick was nearly crushed, saved only by the sudden death of the Russian empress and her successor, who, admiring him, decided to withdraw his troops. This event was later called the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. After all, one principle was affirmed: no single power, however mighty or audacious, could impose total victory. The new order, however fragile, was the result of accepting limits, accepting coexistence with diversity. The picture of the 18th and early 19th centuries shows the Westphalian system operating with a clear logic, balance of power, and the recognition of minimal legitimacy. European dynasties, though differing in religion, customs, or language, shared a common language, both literally and figuratively, among their aristocracy and diplomats. They all spoke French, socialized in salons, and shared notions of honor and the limits of power. In that world, war was no longer total annihilation, but a tool for calculation, limited in scope to specific objectives. But that stability was only on the surface. Hidden beneath the glamour were new seeds of explosion. The Enlightenment spread, asserting the power of reason, science, and the belief that human society could be reorganized according to a transparent logic. Montesquieu wrote about the balance of power not only in diplomacy, but also within government, laying the foundation for the concept of separation of powers. Kant dared to envision a federation of republics committed to perpetual peace, a dream far exceeding reality. The belief in reason led many to mistakenly think that the entire order could be rebuilt solely by thought and principle. Then the French Revolution erupted, turning every idea into a fierce reality. In the whirlwind of revolution, the distinction between domestic and foreign policy blurred. A nation that had just declared equality and freedom for its citizens immediately asserted a mission to bring that freedom across Europe. War was no longer limited, but became a universal mission. For the first time since the Crusades, Europe again faced a movement confident it held the key to humanity's liberation. Revolutionary armies fought not just to defend territory, but to spread a new order. They carried the fervor of religion, but under a secular banner. And when Napoleon appeared, that energy crystallized into a hegemonic ambition, a unified Europe, governed by French law and the codes he promulgated. In the short term, that ambition shook the entire continent, but in the long run, it affirmed a truth: all efforts to impose a single order ultimately fail. Although Napoleon could conquer nearly all of Europe, the balance system ultimately counterattacked. The anti-French coalition gradually formed, and Waterloo became the endpoint of a hegemonic dream. Thus, Westphalian Europe carved out a special path for itself. Order did not come from the unification of power, but from the acceptance of fragmentation and a relentless struggle to maintain equilibrium. It was a fragile, often bloody order, yet more enduring than any dream of unification. And paradoxically, it was in that chaos that Europe sowed the seeds for a new international model capable of spreading across the globe. The Westphalian order was not perfect. It left the door open for war, but also created a mechanism for restraint. It did not promise eternal peace, but granted nations the right to equal existence. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, this model helped Europe maintain a form of relative stability, allowing nations to rise and fall, but none could completely eradicate another. Europe, a land of ceaseless warfare, division, and hatred, was precisely where a global international system was conceived. Not because Europe was wiser or more moral, but because it had no other path. It was the very inability to unify that forced people to invent a mechanism for coexistence, and that mechanism, though born of despair, became the foundation for what we now call the international order. Chapter 2: The European Balance of Power System and its End. Russia had long been an enigma in the European order. Its vast geography, stretching from Europe to Asia, created a nation that was both part of the West and alien to it. While the rest of Europe learned to limit power through balance, Russia was built on completely opposite principles: the absolute power of the Tsar, an orthodox church that rejected pluralism, and an unending ambition for expansion. After a period of chaos, the time of troubles, Russia rebuilt order based on absolute centralization of the throne. With Peter the Great, Russia began to learn military techniques, technology, and even diplomatic protocols from Europe, but never truly integrated. Russia participated in the European balance of power game as an outsider-insider, accepting the principle of balance while simultaneously nurturing ambitions to transcend all limits. In the 19th century, Europe once again had to re-establish order after the Napoleonic whirlwind. When Napoleon was defeated, the great powers met in Vienna to build a new system. The Congress of Vienna, 1814–1815, was a grand effort to heal Europe after more than 2 decades of war. Diplomats like Metternich of Austria, Talleyrand of France, and Castlereagh of Britain negotiated not only borders, but also principles to maintain peace. The unique aspect of the Vienna system was that it did not seek to thoroughly punish the defeated France. Despite having caused so many wars, France was kept at the table as a legitimate member. This reflected a new understanding. To maintain stability, every major power must have a place in the system. Order was not the imposition of the victor, but a minimum consensus among powers. Metternich, Austria's foreign minister, became a symbol of the art of preserving order. He believed that revolution and nationalism were the greatest threats because they disrupted legitimacy and plunged everything into chaos. Therefore, the Vienna system was built not only to balance military power, but also to prevent the spread of revolutionary ideas. The great powers pledged to support each other when a monarchy was threatened by domestic uprisings. This was the concept of the Concert of Europe, an alliance of conservative governments, a kind of order that was both political and ideological. Meanwhile, Bismarck, the 19th century Prussian statesman, was a master of leveraging the balance of power to serve national goals. In contrast to Metternich, Bismarck did not seek to freeze the status quo. He saw that order only existed if it accurately reflected actual power. Thus, he used every tool short wars, clever diplomacy, complex alliances to elevate Prussia into a mighty German empire. Notably, Bismarck never let victory go too far. After defeating Austria, he stopped, not seeking to destroy the enemy, but allowing Austria to continue existing as a potential partner. After defeating France in 1871, he also did not fully exploit the victory to erase that country, merely taking Alsace-Lorraine and declaring the German Empire at Versailles. For Bismarck, a sustainable order was one in which the defeated still had a place for the balance to continue operating. However, not everyone had Bismarck's restraint. As the 20th century approached, new pressures emerged: nationalism, imperialism, industrialization, and an arms race. The balance system that had maintained stability in the 19th century gradually eroded. Entangled alliances, instead of preserving peace, transformed Europe into a powder keg. World War I erupted precisely from the failure of the balance of power. The great powers were bound in a network of military commitments, and just one incident in Sarajevo dragged the entire continent into war. When the war ended, Europe was exhausted, the political map was scrambled, and the idea of a legitimate order like that of Vienna almost vanished. Afterward, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, attempted to erect a new order. But this time, it lacked the shrewdness of Vienna. Instead of integrating the defeated, Versailles chose to severely punish Germany. The result was a system not perceived as legitimate, but merely an imposition by the victorious side. This very injustice sowed the seeds for an even greater war. The 20th century opened, and the balance of power system that had helped Europe maintain stability for over 100 years now became the cause of the continent's descent into total war. Alliance blocs, originally designed to deter, now trapped the great powers in an inescapable vortex. An assassination in Sarajevo in 1914, which should have been a regional conflict, quickly escalated into a world war due to the domino effect of treaty blocs. World War I not only destroyed tens of millions of lives, but also swept away the Vienna Order. Dynasties that had existed for centuries, Habsburg in Austria, Romanov in Russia, Ottoman in Turkey, all collapsed. The map of Europe was torn apart and redrawn, but more importantly, there was a loss of faith. Concepts of legitimacy and balance seemed outdated, no longer powerful enough to stem the tide of ideology and extreme nationalism. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, instead of restoring a central order, sowed further seeds of instability. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, stripped of territory, reduced in military, and compelled to pay colossal reparations. This was no longer a compromise to maintain stability, but an imposed sentence. Versailles created a vindictive peace that left Germans with humiliation and resentment, awaiting a day of resistance. Meanwhile, new international institutions, especially the League of Nations, were too weak to protect order. It lacked enforcement tools, the commitment of great powers, a real balance of power, or a shared belief in legitimacy. The post-Versailles system existed in fragility. In the 1920s and 1930s, Europe fell into two opposing poles. On one side, the impotence of liberal democracy, on the other, the rise of extremism. In Germany, Hitler fully exploited the psychology of humiliation after Versailles, combining it with extreme nationalism and a promise to restore glory. In Italy, Mussolini built a fascist regime. In the Soviet Union, Stalin consolidated a totalitarian state. The traditional balance of power order disintegrated, giving way to an all-encompassing ideological confrontation. The 1930s witnessed a series of failures by the international community. Japan invaded Manchuria, Italy occupied Ethiopia, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, and then annexed Austria. But the League of Nations was impotent, and democratic powers hesitated. The policy of appeasement merely bought time, without changing the fundamental nature of the problem. When Hitler tore up treaties and invaded Poland in 1939, World War II erupted, even more brutal than the previous conflict. After 1945, a new order was established. But this time, unlike Vienna and Versailles, it was no longer an internal European balance. Instead, the world was divided into two global opposing blocs, the United States and the Soviet Union. Europe, once the center of the international order, was now merely a battleground in the Cold War. In Western Europe, the U.S. supported reconstruction and integration, transforming the region into a dynamic democratic and economic bloc. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union imposed a communist system, erecting the Iron Curtain. The traditional balance of power was replaced by an all-encompassing ideological confrontation. Two nuclear superpowers controlled order through mutual deterrence. However, another paradox emerged. The very threat of global nuclear annihilation created a new form of stability. No power dared to let conflict escalate beyond limits because the consequence would be the destruction of all humanity. The classic balance system, based on armies and alliances, was now replaced by a terrible mechanism of balance, mutually assured destruction, MAD. As the 20th century passed its halfway mark, the question was no longer how to maintain balance among European nations, but whether Europe would still retain its central role in the world order. After two great wars, the continent that once dominated the globe was now a devastated land, dependent on two external superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Vienna Order, based on legitimacy and consensus among monarchies, had vanished. The Versailles Order, based on imposition and punishment, had also collapsed. Instead, the Cold War redefined the entire logic of international relations. Two opposing ideologies, liberal democracy and communism, divided the world into irreconcilable blocs, extending beyond Europe's borders. For the United States, the goal was not just to maintain the balance of power, but to spread a universal system of values: democracy, human rights, and market economy. For the Soviet Union, international order meant expanding the communist system, building a socialist bloc under Moscow's leadership. The classical balance, where major nations shared some common principles, was now replaced by an absolute ideological confrontation. The obsession with balance, every military action, every crisis from Berlin to Cuba to Vietnam, was calculated within the limits of a nuclear balance. Mutually assured destruction became the formula for maintaining peace. This was a bitter paradox. Only when humanity faced the risk of suicide did the superpowers restrain themselves to a certain extent. For Europe, the future posed a different question. Could this continent rebuild its own order, transcending its role as a Cold War battleground? After 1945, Western European nations began a new experiment. Instead of competition, they chose cooperation and integration. The European coal and steel community, then the European Union, represented an unprecedented effort to move beyond the logic of balance of power. For the first time in centuries, European nations sought to pool sovereignty rather than merely protect it. However, the question remained: could an order based on shared sovereignty completely replace the tradition of balance of power? And could a Europe that relinquished its military role maintain global influence, or would it merely become a peninsula dependent on American power? The European balance of power system, from Westphalia to Vienna, had once been the central model of international order. But from the 20th century, that model was broken and replaced. Europe was no longer the place that shaped the world, but merely one of many pieces in a new global order where the US, the Soviet Union, and then China, the Middle East, and Asia vied for influence. Therefore, Europe's future no longer lies in recreating a traditional balance of power system, but in its ability to adapt to a broader, more complex order where Europe is only one of many centers of power. Order formed from battles, conferences, and calculated treaties. But the greatest lesson history left for Europe is that no order is permanent, and every system, however cleverly designed, will eventually be tested by new forces, new ideas, and the ceaseless change of humanity. Chapter 3. Political Islam and the Middle East, a World of Chaos. The Islamic world, once an empire stretching from Spain to India, entered the 20th century with a glorious memory but a shattered reality. For centuries, Islam had dominated not only in territory, but also in knowledge, art, and commerce. But the rise of the West with its science, industry, and military might pushed Islamic societies into a subordinate position. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, a fundamental question arose. How could Muslims regain their order and dignity in a world shaped by others? European powers not only divided territories, but also imposed the modern nation-state system on the Middle East, a region previously organized around tribes, religions, and vast empires. Sykes-Picot, Balfour, and countless other treaties redrew the map without regard for history or communal consciousness. The result was nations like Iraq and Jordan, born more on paper than in national identity. This very imposition sowed the seeds for conflicts that would last throughout the century. In this context, the political Islamic movement emerged. It was not just a reaction against colonialism, but a way to redefine world order from an Islamic perspective. Radical Islamists argued that the failure of the Arab world was not due to economic backwardness or military weakness, but to straying from religious roots. They wanted to re-establish a global Islamic community, transcending the national borders the West had erected. The Westphalian order is based on the principle of sovereign states, while the traditional Islamic order is based on the idea of a unified community of believers. Therefore, from the outset, the Islamic world never accepted the artificial boundaries drawn by the great powers. This was not merely a political conflict, but a clash between two philosophical systems of social organization. When the West tried to impose parliamentary democracy, Islamic nations often fell into chaos. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood rose, challenging the modern state. In Iran, the 1979 Islamic Revolution, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, overthrew the monarchy, giving birth to a new political model, a theocratic state. In the mid-20th century, Afghanistan, the intervention of the Soviet Union and the US transformed Islamic resistance into a training ground for the global jihadist movement. I describe these phenomena not merely as violence, but as philosophical reactions. They are attempts to resist an international order from which Muslims feel excluded. In their eyes, the United Nations, international treaties, and even the current world map are tools to legitimize Western domination. Therefore, they do not seek reform from within, but want to replace the entire system. But the paradox lies in this. While radical Islamic movements reject the nation-state, they themselves employ transnational violence to assert their power. Al-Qaeda, and later ISIS, declared the establishment of a caliphate entity beyond the Westphalian order. They use terrorism to prove that even the world's most powerful superpowers cannot impose their rules on them. Meanwhile, mainstream Islamic states like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey find themselves in a dilemma. They want to integrate into the international system to maintain power and develop, but also face internal pressure from radical Islamic movements. Each government must constantly compromise, suppress, or seek to use Islam as its own political tool. The Middle East thus becomes a land of parallel orders, the international map drawn by the West and the spiritual map called for by Islamic movements. Between these two maps, there is no true reconciliation. After the Cold War, many analysts believed that global order would gradually stabilize. Islamic nations, despite conflicts, would seek to integrate into the international state model to survive and develop. But reality proved otherwise. The September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks marked a turning point. Instead of being outsiders in the global power game, radical Islamic movements demonstrated that they could strike directly at the heart of the most powerful superpower. From then on, the Islamic problem was no longer just regional but became global. The U.S. war on terror exemplified the clash between two systems of order. Washington viewed terrorism as a crime against international order and sought to eliminate it with military might. But for jihadists, it was not a crime but a religious duty, a means to break an order they considered unjust from its roots. Therefore, this conflict is not just a security issue, but a confrontation between two political philosophies. The war in Iraq further exposed the inadequacy of this approach. When the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein, they hoped to build a model democratic state, but the result was an explosion of sectarian conflict. Sunnis, who once dominated under Saddam, were removed from power. Shias, the majority, rose with Iranian backing. Meanwhile, Kurds wanted independence. The already fragile Iraqi state, due to artificial borders, quickly disintegrated into fragments. ISIS exploited this vacuum to establish a terrifying caliphate, attracting thousands of fighters from around the world. What is noteworthy is that many young Muslims in Europe, born and raised in democratic societies, became the core force for extremist movements. I see this as a manifestation of an identity crisis. These young people do not find belonging in the nation-state model where they live, but are drawn to a global Islamic community depicted by extremist movements. In other words, this conflict is not only happening in the Middle East, but also infiltrating Paris, London, and Berlin. The issue is not Islam as a religion, but the clash between two understandings of order. The current international order is designed for states to coexist, each autonomous within its borders. In contrast, many Islamic movements do not view the nation-state as a legitimate entity, but as a product imposed from outside. That is why the solution of exporting democracy often fails. You cannot force a community that does not recognize the nation-state to operate according to a modern nation-state model. So, is there a solution? Islamic societies must find a way to integrate into the international order, but on their own terms. If they continue to deny and resist, the cycle of violence will never end. And if the West continues to impose its model without regard for historical roots, the memory of Islamic empires, or the injustice of artificial maps, the conflict will only deepen. The collapse of weak states in the Middle East forced the world to confront the problem of order directly. ISIS was defeated, but the idea of an Islamic community transcending borders will not disappear. The issue is not just defeating a terrorist group, but finding a way to reconcile two philosophies of order that are fundamentally contradictory. I have witnessed many civilizations disintegrate, but never a region that consistently rejected the concept of the nation-state, as in the Middle East. There, the hastily drawn borders on 20th century maps carved into the Islamic memory a lingering dissatisfaction. They do not accept that an artificial line can divide a community of believers that considers itself a unified bloc. Therefore, any attempt to impose a modern nation-state according to European standards becomes kindling. The problem lies in the West's habit of thinking about order as a game of balance of power, states counterbalancing each other, bound by common rules. But for many Muslims, those rules lack legitimacy. Their order is written in the Quran, not in international conventions erected by the West. From this difference, every intervention becomes discordant. You cannot negotiate borders with a movement that does not recognize the concept of borders. Looking at Syria, we see the tragedy clearly. When the uprising against Assad erupted, the world thought it was the beginning of democracy, but within months, Syria turned into a battlefield for dozens of forces. Each group carried its own idea of the correct order, from radical Islamic states to Shia militias supported by Iran, to opposition groups backed by the West. A nation transformed into a testing ground for all forms of power, and the result is an inextricable mess of chaos. In these circumstances, the existing international order is forced to confront a paradox. To maintain stability, they often have to uphold dictatorships that contradict democratic values. This is because dictatorships at least preserve territorial integrity, whereas when they are overthrown, the power vacuum immediately swallows the entire region. So, the West must choose: protect democratic values by accepting chaos, or maintain order by compromising with undemocratic regimes. This is a dilemma where every strategy gets stuck. I once thought that one day, Islamic societies would find their own path to integrate into the international system. But the more I observed, the more I realized that the problem is not just finding a suitable political model, but redefining the concept of order itself. If the world continues to insist on maintaining the Westphalian order, which places the nation-state at the center, we will forever face waves of resistance from communities that reject that concept. But if the world accepts a form of order based on religious or ideological communities transcending borders, then the entire current structure will collapse. This is a vicious circle. One side refuses to abandon the nation-state, the other does not recognize the nation-state. And in between, blood continues to flow. The Americans withdraw, but their shadow remains in every conflict. Weak Islamic states persist, but real power lies in the hands of non-state groups. And the world, helpless, can only observe, hoping that exhaustion will eventually lead to a compromise. The conflict between Islam and the international order is not a solvable problem, but a persistent crack. It reminds us that global order is never immutable. The so-called international order exists only as long as all parties agree to participate in it. When a great civilization feels itself excluded, the entire edifice can shake, and that very shaking is shaping the 21st century. Chapter 4. The United States and Iran: Different Approaches to Order. In the structure of international history, Iran appears as an elusive exception, both ancient and modern, deeply tied to an imperial legacy, yet rebellious against the established international order. When I look at Iran, I always see a paradox. A nation with a distinct history and identity, perhaps one of the most consistent national traditions in the Middle East, yet simultaneously standing outside the Westphalian concept of national sovereignty and equality. Iran's strategic tradition began with the Persian Empire, where a colossal administrative apparatus was built to govern many different peoples, and the monarch was revered as Shahanshah, King of Kings. This instilled in the Persian consciousness a sense of transcendence rather than equality. Iran never saw itself merely as one nation among many, but as the center of a universal order. When the Westphalian order emerged from 17th century Europe, asserting the principle of sovereign equality, Iran seemed to already possess an opposing legacy: a political tradition where the state was not merely a state, but a mission. This very difference led Iran into the modern era with a dual stance, participating in the international system while simultaneously questioning its fundamental principles. Before 1979, Iran was a legitimate member of the Westphalian system, recognized as a normal state, signing treaties, maintaining diplomacy, and simultaneously serving as an important ally of the U.S. in the Cold War. But immediately after the Islamic Revolution, Iran transformed itself into a revolutionary entity, viewing itself not as a nation, but as an instrument of God in a global religious struggle. The 1979 Islamic Revolution was a turning point. It changed not only the regime, but also the very definition of legitimacy. In the Westphalian system, the state exists to protect citizens and sovereignty. In Khomeini's view, the state was merely a means to implement God's will. National boundaries were seen as artificial. The so-called modern Middle East map was a product of immoral treaties that went against the spiritual community of Islam. Therefore, from its early days, the Islamic Republic of Iran declared that its goal was not merely to survive, but to export the revolution. Khomeini's words were clear: current Islamic governments are illegitimate. The revolution's task is to replace them with true Islamic rule. April 1, 1979, was called the first day of God's government, a declaration rejecting all concepts of independent national sovereignty. In that world, Westphalian principles were not just wrong but a threat. Instead of relations between states based on interest and negotiation, Iran asserted that true relations must be founded on a spiritual basis, meaning sharing the same faith and the same religious goal. The consequence was a foreign policy that was both unpredictable and consistent in challenging the existing order. From its early years, Iran provided clear evidence of this view: the seizure of the U.S. Embassy and the 444-day hostage crisis, and later, the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. These actions were not spontaneous, but the inevitable consequence of a political logic. If the state is an instrument of God, then any means to protect the faith are considered legitimate. Despite rejecting Westphalian principles, Iran still had to operate within that very system. It still sent diplomatic missions, signed agreements, and participated in the United Nations. In other words, Iran both broke and exploited the international order. It was a rebellious state, but simultaneously implicitly recognized the existence of the order it wanted to overthrow. This is what makes Iran one of the most challenging cases in global politics. I always saw in post-1979 Iran a strange blend of religious aspiration and pragmatic political skill. When Khomeini took power, he transformed Iran into the only state in the modern world to openly reject the nation-state model as the fundamental political system. He declared that Iran did not exist merely to defend its territory, but to fulfill a metaphysical mission: to liberate the global Islamic community from the artificial orders erected by the West. Khomeini made it clear that the Constitution of the Islamic Republic was merely a means. God's will was the supreme law. And because that will transcended Iran's borders, the revolutionary mission also had to be exportable. The ideal of *velayati faqih, guardianship of the jurist, transformed Iran into the center of an alternative order, where clerical rule dominated not only spiritual life, but also the national power structure. But precisely within that aspiration, a series of internal tensions emerged. On one hand, Iran presented itself as a nation with a global mission. On the other hand, to survive, it still needed to recognize international rules, at least formally. This explains why Iran simultaneously maintained diplomatic relations and nurtured non-state forces like Hezbollah in Lebanon, radical Islamic groups in the Gulf region, or militias in Iraq. In Tehran's eyes, this was not a contradiction but a complement. The legitimate state was used to maintain its standing, while non-state organizations were tools to expand revolutionary influence. From a Western perspective, these actions were seen as destabilizing, but in Iran's logic, this was simply consistency. A nation whose legitimacy comes from God cannot be limited by borders or treaties. The major crises in the 3 decades after 1979, the U.S. hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq War, the conflict in Lebanon all demonstrated this model. When Iran was invaded by Iraq under Saddam Hussein in 1980, Tehran's response was not just territorial defense. It was a holy war, where those who died were considered martyrs and their sacrifice a symbol of defending the Islamic Revolution. Despite heavy losses, Iran still viewed the war as proof of religious legitimacy, strengthening the revolutionary will instead of weakening it. After the war ended, Iran continued to choose a path of challenge rather than integration. But that challenge did not mean self-destruction. Iran understood the limits of its power. Therefore, instead of direct confrontation, they chose the path of proxy and asymmetrical warfare. In Lebanon, Hezbollah became Iran's representative force, fighting Israel and serving as a springboard for regional influence. In Iraq, after 2003, Shia militias became extensions of Tehran's strategy. The key point is that Iran never saw itself as a blindly rebellious state. They believed they were shaping an alternative order. From that perspective, terrorism, proxy wars, or proliferation were not isolated actions, but manifestations of a consistent ideology: resisting Western imposition and building a unified Islamic community. But this very steadfastness has put Iran in direct conflict with the U.S. and its allies. While Washington prioritizes regional stability and maintaining the flow of oil, Tehran views instability as an opportunity to expand its influence. These two conflicting visions make every reconciliation effort fragile. The next, and perhaps most dangerous turning point, was Iran's pursuit of a nuclear program. Here again, there is a parallel between revolutionary logic and the logic of power. Symbolically, nuclear power helps Iran demonstrate that it is on par with superpowers, despite sanctions and isolation. Practically, nuclear weapons provide Iran with an effective deterrent, making adversaries reconsider direct confrontation. What worries the West is not just Iran's nuclear technology, but the ideological context behind it. A nation that declares international law to be an immoral product of the West, a nation willing to support non-state groups using violence, now approaching nuclear capability. This is not just a security problem, but a challenge to the entire international order. I noticed that throughout this process, Iran never succumbed to mere impulsiveness. On the contrary, they are very patient. They negotiate when necessary, sign agreements when it is advantageous, but never abandon their long-term goals. For them, détente is merely a tool to gain more time and resources, while the core objectives exporting the revolution, defending the Shia Islamic identity, and challenging the West remain unchanged. There is a paradox always present in Iran's behavior. The more they declare opposition to the international order, the more they exploit the very mechanisms of that order to consolidate their position. Iran participates in the United Nations, signs many international conventions, and sometimes accepts nuclear dialogue. But at the same time, they use their member status as a forum to denounce the West, turning international conferences into a stage for their revolutionary message. When the West imposes sanctions, Iran learns to turn hardship into internal political advantage. Scarcity, instead of destabilizing the regime, is used as evidence of the world's injustice. The clerical leaders constantly reiterate the message: if the people suffer, it is not because the government is weak, but because Western enemies want to strangle the Islamic revolution. In this adversity, Tehran's steadfastness becomes a tool to mobilize national strength. The nuclear policy also reflects Iran's handling of this paradox. They publicly declare that their nuclear program is for peaceful purposes. They cite that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty grants all nations the right to develop civil nuclear technology. But internally, the world remains skeptical, and Tehran skillfully exploits that skepticism. With each prolonged round of negotiations, they gain more time to refine their technology. This is the art of endless bargaining, always giving the impression of being ready to compromise but never abandoning the core. And in this game, time is on Iran's side. They calculate that the West is tired of prolonged conflicts, while Iran is accustomed to isolation and living in adversity. If they wait long enough, sanctions will ease, and then Iran can emerge on equal footing. Another aspect that is less fully recognized: Iranian identity is not only encapsulated in religion, but also in the memory of a long-lasting empire. From ancient Persia to the Safavid era, Iran has always seen itself as a center of civilization, not a vassal of anyone. The 1979 Islamic Revolution, though cloaked in theology, actually reawakened that memory. It led Iran to see itself not just as a religious state, but as a rival civilization, with a mission to shape new rules of the game. But it is precisely this combination of religious ideals and imperial legacy that makes the world uneasy. A nation that simultaneously declares opposition to the immoral Western order, nurtures nuclear ambitions, and harbors memories of regional hegemony, clearly cannot become a reliable partner. From here, all US and European policies toward Iran are torn. Sanctioning too heavily could make Iran more aggressive, but conceding too much legitimizes the very challenging model. Throughout the early 21st century, this paradox became even clearer. As Washington sought to reshape the Middle East after 9/11, Iran was simultaneously a sworn enemy and an indispensable actor. In Afghanistan, the US needed Iran to counter the Taliban. In Iraq, the presence of Iranian-backed Shia militias became a decisive factor. All US calculations had to acknowledge that no solution in the Middle East could ignore Iran, and that was Tehran's strategic victory. An isolated actor, forcing the entire world to engage in dialogue. The final point I want to emphasize: Iran is not a fleeting phenomenon. It is an alternative model, an ongoing historical experiment. The big question is not just whether Iran will acquire nuclear weapons, but whether an international order based on law, nation-states, and sovereignty can accommodate an entity that derives its legitimacy from God. This is not merely a security question, but a challenge to the fundamental concepts of the modern world. In this view, Iran is like a mirror. It forces the West to ask itself whether the international order, which originated from Westphalia, is truly universal or merely a product of a Western historical phase, now challenged by a different civilizational model. Iran's existence does not allow us to easily believe that there is an end of history. Instead, it suggests a reality. World order is always fragile and can always be redefined from an entirely different perspective. Asterisk Chapter 5, Asia's Pluralism Asterisk. Asia, at first glance, seems like a unified concept, but in reality, it resembles a never-complete mosaic. From a historical perspective, it is precisely the disagreement over fundamental ideas that has defined this continent's identity. In Europe, a term like Europe, or the image of a Roman civilization, once instilled in the collective memory a common sense of unity. But in Asia, no indigenous language ever produced an equivalent to Asia. There is no collective memory of an empire encompassing the entire continent. What the West assigned the two words, Asia, was merely an external grouping, a way of naming to differentiate, more than a reflection of reality. In fact, Asia encompasses a series of disparate historical experiences. China with its ancient tributary system, India with its religiously intertwined social structure, Japan with its isolationist and distinct identity, Central Asia with its nomadic heritage and Mongol empires, and Southeast Asian lands steeped in colonial influence. Here, there is no common denominator for legitimacy, nor a shared collective memory of a central order. And it is this very absence that makes every discussion about an Asian order always begin with a paradox. How to build a balance of power system in a context that has never had a comprehensive model. If we draw the political-economic map of Asia today, we will see a multi-layered picture. Highly developed industrial powers like Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. Continental powers with global ambitions like China, India, and Russia. Populous island nations like Indonesia and the Philippines. Ancient monarchies and communities of mainland Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, and deeply Islamic lands stretching from Pakistan, Bangladesh to West Asia. Added to this is a mysterious, isolated North Korea, possessing nuclear weapons, becoming a piece that is both unpredictable and undeniable. The common thread, if any, is the experience of colonialism or semi-colonialism that most countries endured in the 19th and 20th centuries, except for Japan and somewhat Thailand. Most were objects of an order imposed by European or American powers. Unlike Europe, where the Westphalian system formed after religious wars and was deeply etched in collective consciousness, Westphalian-style diplomacy arrived late in Asia, tied to the decolonization movement after World War II and the birth of modern nation-states. Here, this often came with extreme violence. The Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the India-Pakistan conflicts, the Vietnam War, interventions in Cambodia, the Sino-Indian and Sino-Vietnamese wars. No region in the world after 1945 experienced so much bloody upheaval. But from the fires of war, a new reality emerged. When the Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore rose from the 1970s, when Japan proved to be an efficient industrial democracy model, and when China began reforms from the late 1970s, the region's face changed rapidly. From a picture of division and violence, Asia suddenly appeared as a center of global economic growth. Along with that rise came the introduction and assertion of Westphalian principles. Asian nations strongly declared sovereignty, self-determination, and non-interference. In a military forum, a Chinese general even directly cited the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia as the foundation for national equality. What was once seen as a purely European product now became a tool for Asian nations to protect their identity and interests. Yet this order remains incomplete. Asia today does not have an automatic balance of power mechanism like 19th century Europe. Instead, at least two main balances exist, one in South Asia, revolving around the India-Pakistan confrontation, and one in East Asia, focusing on the US-China-Japan triangle, along with the Korean peninsula. Both regions lack a neutral balancer like Britain once was in Europe. As a result, every move is direct, easily escalating into crisis if diplomatic regulation is absent. The United States, with its extra-regional status, has become a special factor. After withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, Washington was forced to redefine its approach. Would it continue to maintain its presence as a balancer, or step back and let nations fend for themselves? If the U.S. does not actively create a regional order, will that vacuum drag countries into an endless spiral of confrontation? Asia, therefore, cannot be seen merely as a continent on a map. It is a collection of historical experiences, different collective memories, colonial wounds, and modern national ambitions. Each nation simultaneously carries the shadow of an old order and faces the challenge of building a new one. And if Europe found balance through covenants, Asia is still grappling with the question: can a common framework of order be found, or is its destiny an incomplete symbiosis between competition and cooperation? If Asia is a mosaic, then each piece, Japan, India, China, the East Asian tigers, reflects a distinct history, simultaneously interacting and overlapping. Japan, a unique island nation in the global system. Japan has long held an extraordinary position. For centuries, this nation chose isolation, closing its borders under the Tokugawa shogunate, maintaining internal order through a class system, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. This isolation allowed Japan to avoid the trap of colonialism when European powers encroached on Asia. When forced to open up after Perry's expedition in 1853, Japan did not accept a passive role. The Meiji Restoration became a rare historical turning point. An ancient culture selectively absorbed Western technology, organizational models, and then used that very strength to build its own empire. In just a few decades, Japan defeated China and then even Russia, becoming the first Asian power recognized in the world arena. The paradox is that when Japan joined the international system, it did not seek to share order with Europe, but wanted to prove itself equal, even superior, through military might. The consequence was the 20th century witnessing aggressive expansion, the invasion of Manchuria, the Sino-Japanese War, and then World War II. After defeat, Japan made another extraordinary pivot. Instead of returning to extreme nationalism, it chose to become a strategic ally of the U.S., building a parliamentary democracy while focusing on industrial and technological development. Today, Japan remains a paradox of the Asian order. A wealthy, democratic nation closely tied to the U.S., but still haunted by war memories and constrained by its pacifist constitution. The slow rearmament in recent years shows that Tokyo no longer accepts a passive role in the regional picture. India, from ancient civilization to modern nation-state asterisk. If Japan is an example of extreme adaptation, India is a testament to internal complexity. Unlike China, India never formed a centralized bureaucratic system spanning thousands of years. What was called India in history was actually a collection of countless kingdoms, religions, and languages. This diversity was both a strength and a challenge. When the British arrived, they not only conquered a territory, but also restructured the concept of India. Colonial rule brought railways, an administrative system, and English as a linking language, but simultaneously sowed new divisions in society, especially between Hindus and Muslims. The independence movement led by Gandhi was a great nonviolent effort, but the partition of 1947 left wounds that have never healed. India and Pakistan were born in violence, and the subsequent nuclear standoff is a direct consequence. Today, India is the world's largest democracy with a rising economy, a young workforce, and aspirations to be recognized as a global power. But a fragmented political system, complex religious and ethnic dynamics, along with the burden of poverty, still force New Delhi to juggle two worlds. On one hand, a global leadership role. On the other, responsibility for hundreds of millions of people living below the minimum threshold. In its security strategy, India faces two challenges: long-term competition and confrontation with Pakistan, and the continuous rise of China. Both force New Delhi to maintain a stance that is both restrained and ready to use force. This tension makes South Asia one of the most volatile hotspots on the planet. China, imperial memory, and the desire for Renaissance asterisk. One cannot speak of Asian order without mentioning China. For Beijing, the concept of order is not a product of Westphalia, but but is linked to its millennia-old tributary system. In traditional Chinese thought, China was the celestial empire, the center of civilization, while surrounding nations were mere vassals, paying tribute to receive benevolence. The collapse of this system in the 19th century, when Western powers imposed unequal treaties, seized territory, and forced China to open up, created a deep memory of humiliation, a century of humiliation, and this memory never faded. It became the psychological foundation for all modern policies. After 1949, the People's Republic of China reshaped the nation according to Marxist-Leninist ideology, but the imperial instinct remained. Reforms from the late 1970s transformed China from an agricultural economy to the world's factory. Today, with growing military and economic power and expanding influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing wants to prove it is no longer a victim, but an architect of a new order. However, the paradox lies in this. While the West emphasizes international law and national equality, China leans towards concepts of hierarchy and tribute, making the Asian order always unstable. The East Asian Tigers, unconventional rise. If Japan, China, and India are three major poles, then East Asia's mainland and peninsula have seen smaller but equally important nations emerge: South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia. All are collectively known as the Tigers, and have proven that modernization does not necessarily require a single model. South Korea is a special example. From a war-torn peninsula, where the northern half was closed off in totalitarianism, and the southern half was initially a poor, aid-dependent economy, South Korea broke through to become a technological powerhouse in less than half a century. Yet the wound of division still haunts it. The two Koreas are a living symbol of ideological confrontation and a constant nuclear threat. Singapore shows another direction. A city-state lacking resources, but through its port nation strategy, political discipline, and open policies, it has become a leading global financial center. This success cannot be separated from its skillful balancing act between the great powers the US, China, and even India. Taiwan is another paradox. In reality, a prosperous democracy, the world's most important microchip manufacturing hub, yet legally, it exists in a gray area, not widely recognized as an independent state, and always seen by Beijing as a rebellious province. Taiwan's existence, therefore, becomes the most sensitive point in US-China relations, capable of igniting a global crisis at any moment. A commonality among these tigers is that they do not seek to redefine the regional order, but rather to exploit it. They leverage US security patronage, the open markets of globalization, and cultural flexibility to carve out their own positions. But this very dependence makes them vulnerable to major strategic shifts like US-China competition or spreading protectionism. The role of the US, patron or outsider. A pervasive question in Asian order is whether a stable regional order can exist without the US after World War II. The US became the security architect and guarantor for much of Asia-Pacific. Bilateral treaties with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, military presence in Okinawa, and the role of the Seventh Fleet transformed Washington into a strategic gatekeeper. This presence was both a shield and a constraint. Japan and South Korea enjoyed nuclear security guarantees, but simultaneously had to align their foreign policies with Washington's orbit. For China, the US presence was both a challenge and an opportunity. For Southeast Asian nations, the US was a necessary counterweight to balance China's influence. But the US cannot forever be a free protector. In recent decades, Washington has repeatedly witnessed skepticism from its allies. Is the US willing to pay the price to defend a small, distant island or maintain troops in lands that domestic voters consider a burden? This uncertainty has prompted many Asian nations to start looking out for themselves. Japan is considering constitutional amendments. South Korea is developing advanced weaponry, and ASEAN is seeking to build a common voice. ASEAN, experimenting with regional community. In an Asia divided by history, ASEAN stands out as a self-initiated effort to build stability. Initially a loose association of 5 Southeast Asian nations, in 1967, ASEAN today has expanded to 10 members with the ambition of building a community. What is special about ASEAN is not its limited hard power, but its ability to create a space for dialogue. The principles of consensus and non-interference in internal affairs are considered by many to be weaknesses, but they also help smaller countries avoid being forced to choose sides in US-China competition. Thanks to this, ASEAN has become the conference hub of Asia, where all great powers must appear and negotiate. However, the limitations are also very clear. When crises erupt, such as the South China Sea issue, ASEAN is often paralyzed, unable to take a strong common stance. The diversity of interests among members makes ASEAN easily divisible. The Korean Peninsula, the most dangerous flashpoint. Nowhere is the instability of the Asian order more evident than on the Korean Peninsula. This is the only battlefield of the Cold War that has never officially ended. The 1953 armistice only froze the conflict, without resolving it. North Korea, an isolated, sanctioned nation persistently pursuing nuclear weapons, has upended all security calculations in the region. For the US, it is a direct threat to allies and potentially to American territory itself. For China, Pyongyang is both a security buffer and an uncontrollable burden. For South Korea and Japan, it is a constant threat, forcing them to depend more on Washington. The paradox is that all great powers see the danger, but no one benefits if the Pyongyang regime collapses. A chaotic North Korea could trigger waves of refugees, war, and a deeper US presence right on China's border. Therefore, the North Korean crisis has become a semi-permanent condition. Everyone wants a solution, but no one wants a definitive one. The future of Asian order, a new Westphalia. Looking at Asia as a whole, there has never been a regional order in the strict sense. Each major power, China, India, Japan, carries its own memories and models. The East Asian tigers leverage US patronage but lack the capacity to build a system themselves. ASEAN creates a forum but lacks the power to bind. North Korea remains a persistent source of instability. The crucial question is, can Asia find its own Westphalian agreement on common principles, or will it continue to operate in a pluralistic state where no one can define the ultimate rules of the game? Chapter 6. Towards an Asian order, confrontation or partnership. When speaking of Europe, one can easily refer to a clear legacy. The Westphalian system, where states are recognized as supreme, standing on equal footing in an international space, with no one claiming absolute centrality. Asia is different. Here, historical memory is marked by models of order not based on equality, but on hierarchy, ambiguity in sovereignty, and a sense of the universality of cultural power. And this very fact makes it difficult for Asia today, while affirming independence and sovereignty, to find common ground for a stable regional order. Most Asian nations, whether wealthy or poor, populous or small, view themselves as rising nations. They link their development to a historical obsession with having been interfered with by outsiders, dominated, or at least cut off from their inherent pace of development. In the collective consciousness, the period of Western dominance is merely a temporary detour, not the natural order. Therefore, restoring a golden horizon becomes a common motivation. But paradoxically, with the same longing, nations draw different lessons and choose contradictory paths. Some nations assert their path to ascent through economic power and trade integration. Others see building military capacity as a vital condition to gain position. Some civilizations take pride in ancient traditions, asserting legitimacy through cultural depth, while other nations, formed later, rely on modern ideas of sovereignty and the nation-state as non-negotiable foundations. In this context, calls for win-win cooperation, or not zero-sum, are frequent, but in reality, they are overshadowed by struggles for influence. Cooperation can only become the foundation of order when parties are willing to adjust their ambitions to create common space. Conversely, if each nation simultaneously desires cooperation and asserts its unique status, order will easily become a fragile picture, always at risk of collapse due to unforeseen clashes. This becomes even more dangerous because modern weapons no longer allow strategic errors to be safely corrected as in 19th century Europe. When destructive power can be deployed in an instant, every miscalculation, every experiment with power carries incalculable risks. In this picture, Asia emerges as a continent with two main balances of power: South Asia and East Asia. Each region has its own opposing centers and tensions, but both lack an element that Europe once possessed: a balancer, one who is willing to lean towards the weaker side to maintain central equilibrium. This absence makes the Asian order inherently unstable. There is no force playing the role of extinguishing the flame before it turns into a huge fire. In South Asia, India and Pakistan have maintained a confrontational stance since partition, now adding nuclear weapons to that conflict. In East Asia, China and Japan have not yet healed historical memories, while territorial disputes and questions about the U.S. role have never subsided. And in both these regions, the United States, the only force with enough stature to be a balancer, appears hesitant, simultaneously wanting to preserve its power and fearing being drawn into endless confrontations. This worldview forces us to re-examine the history of Asian order. Before the West imposed Westphalian norms, Asia had its own distinct forms that cannot be described as a unified Asian system, as it was divided into multiple orbits. In the north, from Central Asia to Russia, the legacy of Mongols, Russians, and Islam created an order linked to steppes and conquest. In the east, the Chinese tributary system radiated downwards into Southeast Asia, simultaneously asserting the centrality of the Celestial Empire while allowing neighboring countries to maintain their distinct identities. Meanwhile, in India and Southeast Asia, the influence of Hinduism and Buddhism produced a concept of kingship as a sacred symbol, different from both Chinese and Western approaches. These orders shared a commonality. They did not emphasize the concept of the independent sovereign state like Westphalia. They operated through overlapping influences, symbols, rituals, and the acceptance of a hierarchical order. Thus, when Westphalian norms entered Asia through the West, they did not integrate naturally, but existed as an external overlay. Today, all these legacies clash and co-evolve. Asian nations assert sovereignty in the modern sense, but in their consciousness, traces of the old systems still exist. China acts both as a modern nation-state and evokes memories of Tianxia, a sphere of cultural influence where China is not just a great power, but the pivot of the region. India seeks to shape a new role in a multipolar region while constantly comparing itself to the legacy of an ancient civilization. Southeast Asian countries, meanwhile, choose a strategy of riding the wind, maintaining flexibility between poles. The question arises: can Asia create a new order that simultaneously recognizes sovereignty, learns the lesson of balance, and finds common legitimate principles, or will it slide into an endless spiral of confrontation? For centuries, China did not view the world through Westphalian eyes. For Chinese dynasties, there was only one center, the Celestial Empire. The Chinese emperor was not a monarch on par with other kings, but the Son of Heaven, mandated by heaven to rule all under heaven. The very name shows the difference. The country is called Zhongguo, China, the Middle Kingdom. The tributary system operated on this principle. Neighboring countries came to offer tribute, acknowledging the superior role of the Celestial Empire. In return, they received titles, gifts, and most importantly, legitimate recognition. But that system, contrary to simple imagination, was not merely a coercive relationship. It was ritualistic, symbolic, more than administrative control. Vassal states from Korea and Vietnam to Southeast Asian kingdoms maintained broad autonomy, as long as the formal subjugation was not broken. What is special here is that China, in its tradition, did not need to expand territory at all costs to demonstrate power. This view, that China was the center of civilization and everything beyond was barbarian, led the empire to prioritize maintaining a cultural order over establishing fixed borders. For them, legitimacy did not come from horizontal agreement, but from the acknowledgement of an existing order tied to the mandate of heaven. Therefore, when the West imposed modern international norms in the 19th century, China faced an identity shock. Unequal treaties forced Beijing to recognize that it was merely one nation among many others, equal but not superior. This was a fundamental upheaval to the Chinese worldview, as it denied the central role that was considered self-evident. The following decades, from the Opium Wars to the collapse of the Qing dynasty, China went through a period they called the Century of Humiliation. It was not just military defeat or territorial loss, but a crisis of identity. What was China if not the center of the world? When the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the spirit of national rejuvenation was linked to erasing that humiliation. Mao Zedong and subsequent leaders all emphasized that China would never again allow itself to be manipulated. But at the same time, deep down, there remained a desire to restore a special status, not just as a strong nation, but as a leading civilization, the duality of modern China. Today, China operates on two levels. On one hand, it accepts the Westphalian framework of state and sovereignty, building military capabilities, participating in international organizations, and using modern diplomatic language. On the other hand, it evokes memories of Tianxia *, a sphere of cultural influence where China is not just a great power, but the pivot of the region. We see this clearly in initiatives like the Belt and Road or discourses on a community of shared future. Instead of talking about a European-style balance of power, China uses language about harmony and common development, but hidden beneath is a familiar logic. Recognize Beijing's central status in exchange for economic benefits and stability. This raises a big question: how will neighboring countries react? For many Southeast Asian countries, they see immediate benefits from economic cooperation, but also fear long-term dependence. Japan views this rise through the lens of a haunting historical memory. India, as another ancient civilization, sees this as a symmetrical challenge. And the US, an extra-regional superpower, perceives the reemergence of China's centrality as a global strategic challenge. The irony is that the more China asserts its historical role, the more it isolates itself through suspicion. The old tributary system worked because it existed in a context where the West had not yet imposed norms of sovereign equality. But in the modern world, where every nation, however small, asserts absolute autonomy, any notion of hierarchical order is difficult to accept. As a result, China faces a fundamental paradox. It wants to be the center, but must operate within a system that denies the concept of a center. It wants to call for cooperation, but its language and actions evoke fears of hegemony. The strategic consequence. This makes China a decisive factor in the opening question: will Asia enter an order of partnership or confrontation? If Beijing can combine its newfound power with legitimate restraint, Asia has the opportunity to form a stable structure. But if it chooses the old path of asserting supreme power, Asia risks replaying Europe's tragedy before World War I, a region that cannot find common ground, where any clash can ignite an explosion. India, the symmetrical civilization. If China views itself as the celestial empire, India is also a civilization with a deep sense of its uniqueness. India's history spans thousands of years of philosophy, religion, and empire, but it was rarely led by a single, long-lasting center. This pluralism and cultural vibrancy shaped India's identity as both self-confident and reserved in foreign policy. When it gained independence in 1947, Prime Minister Nehru chose the path of non-alignment. This was not just a strategy to escape the grip of the Cold War, but also reflected a mindset. India did not want to be seen as a tool in the game of other great powers. But at the same time, New Delhi yearned to be recognized as a global power center, a status commensurate with its civilizational depth. Today, China's rise presents India with a dual challenge: a geostrategic rival and an indispensable economic partner. The two countries share a long border, had a war in 1962, and have many simmering tensions. But both also know that if they fall into conflict, Asia will lose its opportunity to rise as a global pole. What makes India different is how it views order. Not a hierarchical system like China's, but a multipolar order where many civilizations coexist and have a voice. This leads New Delhi to constantly consider its role as a bridge, cooperating with the US, Japan, and ASEAN, while maintaining a strategic distance to avoid absolute entanglement. Japan, between the ghosts of the past and the resilience of recovery. In the 20th century, Japan went from one extreme to another, from a militaristic power ready to challenge both West and Asia to a nation devastated by war and bound by a pacifist constitution. But the post-war economic miracle transformed Japan into Asia's economic pillar. The wealthier it became, the more Japan was haunted by the memories of war. Its military resurgence is constrained by its own constitution and domestic public opinion. But at the same time, China's presence is forcing Tokyo to redefine itself. Will it forever remain an economic power dependent on the American umbrella, or will it gradually reclaim a strategic political role? The Japan-China relationship is a series of paradoxes. Close trade cooperation, but deep strategic suspicion, both benefiting from globalization, but constantly clashing over island disputes and historical memories. For Japan, the question is not just dealing with China, but also redefining its national identity, from a quiet economic power to an active player in the Asian order. Southeast Asia, the center of competition. If there is any region that most clearly feels the pressure from China's rise and US-China competition, it is Southeast Asia. With its strategic location on one of the world's busiest maritime routes, Southeast Asia has always been a crossroads of power flows. ASEAN, a rare regional organization founded and maintained by developing countries, strives to create a center for dialogue. But in reality, member states have diverse interests and varying degrees of dependence on China, and the US. This often leaves ASEAN in a state of fragile consensus, not strong enough to shape order, but also not wanting to be sidelined. Southeast Asia's choice reflects a pragmatic philosophy, not opposing China, but also not entrusting its future entirely to Beijing. Countries simultaneously seek investment and trade, while calling for the presence of the US and extra-regional partners for balance. This is where the Asian order becomes complex. No single party can impose absolutely, and no party wants to fully withdraw. The role of the US, extra-regional superpower. Without the US presence, the story of Asian order would be very different. After World War II, the US became the security guarantor for Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, playing an extra-regional balancing role. Washington brought not only military power, but also shaped international trade and financial principles. But with China's rise, the question is how long can the US maintain that role? Will it be willing to confront directly, or will it seek to share spheres of influence? Both options carry risks. Direct confrontation could push the region into a new Cold War spiral. Too much concession would make allies suspicious and pave the way for China to build its own order. The US is accustomed to a universal global order where rules and values are broadly applied. But Asia, with its multi-layered history and distinct civilizational traditions, may not accept a cookie-cutter model. The biggest challenge for Washington is not power, but the ability to reconcile diversity rather than merely impose. What order for Asia? Asia stands at a crossroads. One path leads to cooperation, where China, India, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the US together build a balanced security and economic structure, acknowledging diversity and sharing benefits. The other path leads to confrontation, where suspicion, territorial competition, and hegemonic ambitions push the region into an uncontrolled spiral. The very shared prosperity that once brought hope to Asia could become kindling if not skillfully managed. If great powers view growth as leverage to impose, there will instead of a foundation for sharing. Asia risks replaying Europe's tragedy before World War I, but if they learn lessons from the past, Asia could become the birthplace of a new order, not just regional but global. Chapter 7. Acting for All Humanity, the United States and its Concept of Order. When a nation accustomed to the security of two enveloping oceans suddenly sees itself as an indispensable actor in global order, it's not just a policy change, it's a pivotal shift in ideology. The United States in the late 19th century was no longer just a self-contained democratic experiment, but began to view itself under the harsh light of the world. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was the opening point. From a seemingly small conflict in the Caribbean, it brought the United States to Manila, planted its feet in the Pacific, and marked a moment from which history could not turn back. The U.S. was not just a nation in the Americas, but a superpower with transcontinental reach. Washington viewed this not as a temporary adventure, but as historical proof that the U.S., whether it wanted to or not, had been pushed into the center of world politics. In this context, Theodore Roosevelt emerged not as a dreamer, but as a pragmatist who believed that international order would only stand firm when power was recognized and threats could be actualized. He harbored no illusions that good intentions alone were enough to keep peace. On the contrary, Roosevelt understood that an empty warning, without the capacity to act, would only invite contempt from adversaries. He wanted the U.S. to act as a truly weighty nation, both ready to use force and wise enough to restrain itself from becoming an aggressor. During Roosevelt's presidency, the U.S. became a paradoxical image. On one hand, a nation always extolling liberty and democracy. On the other, a rising superpower deploying its great white fleet across oceans as a show of force. Roosevelt saw the U.S. as a new player in Europe's ancient game, where the balance of power was the only accepted language. He did not seek to break the rules, but to assert that the U.S. was strong enough to sit on par with long-established empires. In Roosevelt, we see a muscular concept of order. World order cannot be maintained by moral declarations, but by military presence, by the readiness to intervene. But also from him, we see the seeds of the American paradox. This nation, while asserting itself as a superpower, simultaneously sowed the idea that its power was used not just for its own benefit, but for the common good of humanity. The phrase, "for all mankind," would become a recurring refrain throughout the entire 20th century. Cold reality, yet associating itself with a lofty mission, a paradox, but also the paradox that nourished America's unique strength, both pragmatic and idealistic, intervening with guns and simultaneously declaring action for global morality. If Roosevelt embodied practical power, ready to adjust the military balance, his ideological successor, Woodrow Wilson, led the U.S. in the opposite direction, idealistic and metaphysical. In Wilson, the United States was no longer just a powerfully armed nation in the old system, but became the architect of a new order based on moral and legal principles. Wilson did not speak of the balance of power because, in his eyes, it was the language of decaying empires, of selfish compromises. He spoke of justice and democracy. For Wilson, American power only had meaning if it served a universal vision, making the world safe for democracy, liberating peoples from the shackles of imperialism, and replacing the power game with an order based on international law. What was special about Wilson was not just his goals, but how he linked ideals to America's historical mission. This nation, in his view, was not a new empire but a chosen community to enlighten the world. He linked America's role to global destiny, seeing the expansion of democracy and the establishment of international alliances not as strategy, but as a moral duty. When World War I ended, Wilson brought to the Paris Peace Conference a dazzling vision, a perpetual peace based on his famous 14 points, notably including national self-determination, open covenants, and most importantly, the creation of the League of Nations. This was not just a political plan, but a declaration that the era of secret diplomacy and power conflicts had ended, giving way to a transparent and cooperative global system. But historical reality poured cold water on that ideal. European allies, Britain and France, were still haunted by war losses and wanted to punish Germany rather than build an ideal order. Even at home, the U.S. Congress refused to join the League of Nations, severing the central role Wilson envisioned. And so, the American paradox appeared starkly. A president asserting that the U.S. must lead the world, but a public withdrawing into isolationism, shying away from global burdens. This did not diminish Wilson's influence. On the contrary, his legacy became an undercurrent in American politics. Though it failed at the time, Wilson instilled in the national consciousness a new definition. The United States not only protects its interests, but also serves as the conscience of humanity. From then on, whenever the U.S. engaged in war or intervention, the question revolved not just around power, but around moral righteousness. If Roosevelt taught America that power needed to be demonstrated, Wilson instilled in America the belief that power was only legitimate when linked to ideals. These two currents, seemingly contradictory, actually together shaped the nature of the U.S. in the 20th century, both pragmatic and idealistic, both a power player and a global missionary. This very internal tension created the way the U.S. entered every crisis, with guns in hand and declarations of justice on its lips. When the cannons of World War II roared, the United States once again faced a historical choice. Initially, as before, the nation was immersed in hesitation. Should it maintain its isolationist stance or intervene in a distant war? But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the choice disappeared. This time, the U.S. not only participated, but emerged as the decisive force in global destiny. Unlike World War I, the United States entered World War II with overwhelming strength, colossal industrial potential, a homeland safe from bombs, and a stable political system. Washington quickly became the arsenal of the free world, providing not only weapons, but also the belief that a new order could emerge from the ashes of Europe and Asia. The victory in 1945 ushered in an unprecedented moment. For the first time in history, a nation across an ocean became the center of world order. The U.S. was not devastated like Europe, not exhausted like the old powers, but emerged as an economic, military, and spiritual leading force. This was the beginning of what people call the American century. However, that order was quickly challenged. The Soviet Union, a wartime ally, became a post-war adversary. Instead of lasting peace, the world entered the Cold War-an all-encompassing confrontation, not through total battles, but through ideological competition, influence, and nuclear power. In this context, the two legacies of Roosevelt and Wilson both became tools. From Roosevelt, the U.S. maintained a formidable military, built NATO, established global bases, and unprecedented empire covering both oceans and space. From Wilson, the U.S. declared a mission to defend freedom, oppose communism, and build a free world as opposed to a totalitarian empire. But what is interesting is that the United States never claimed to be an empire. On the contrary, they always asserted they were acting on behalf of humanity. Every intervention, from Berlin to Korea to Vietnam, was justified not only by strategic interests, but by moral responsibility. This is a fundamental difference. While old empires acted in the name of national interest, the U.S. acted in the name of a global ideal. The Cold War was therefore not just a military confrontation, but also a philosophical debate. Should world order be based on individual freedom, market economies, and democracy, or on centralized control and ideology? The United States turned its very existence into the answer. American prosperity, innovation, and power were presented as proof of the superiority of the democratic model. Although sometimes compromising, sometimes getting bogged down as in Vietnam, the U.S. maintained its central position. Because while the Soviet Union relied on fear and coercion, the U.S. relied on both hard and soft power. Allies followed not just because they were forced, but because they believed they were participating in a common project to protect global freedom. When the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, many believed that Wilson's legacy had finally triumphed. The world would unite under a liberal democratic model, and the U.S. would become the sole guarantor of a global order. But the American paradox was never that simple. The rise of the U.S. as the sole superpower rekindled the old question: what is this nation? A new empire or the conscience of humanity? Chapter 8. The United States, the reluctant, multifaceted superpower. From the dawn of the Cold War, the United States stepped into an unprecedented historical role. Both a victorious nation in World War II and one burdened with the mission of leading an international order against an all-encompassing ideological adversary, the Soviet Union. But the paradox that clung to America never let go. They simultaneously believed they held a universal idea that could save the world, while fearing the cost of turning that ideal into reality. It is from this starting point that the image of the reluctant superpower was born. The beginning of the Cold War. The world after 1945 did not allow the United States the opportunity to retreat into familiar isolationism. The atomic bomb, the rise of the Soviet Union, and the power vacuum in Europe and Asia forced the U.S. into a position where it had to make a choice, not between intervention or non-intervention, but between two types of intervention: passive and fragmented, or actively shaping a new order. Washington chose the latter. George Kennan's containment policy became the guiding principle. In that vision, the U.S. did not seek to destroy the Soviet Union immediately, but to build a long-term arc of containment, waiting for the adversary to weaken under the weight of its own system. From here, a series of new mechanisms were born. The Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, NATO as a military shield, bilateral defense treaties in Asia. These institutions were not just tools of containment, but also reflected a structured order, with the U.S. at its center. For the first time in history, the United States abandoned its post-war isolationist model to accept the role of permanent patron. The strategy of a Cold War order, * the specificity of the American order during this period lay in the combination of military might, economic aid, and liberal democratic ideology. But within that very combination, we clearly see the reluctance. The U.S. simultaneously wanted to promote its values and feared overstretch if it had to deploy forces on many fronts. On one hand, Washington provided generous aid, built the IMF, World Bank, and GATT to bind allies and create a network of interdependence. On the other hand, they also set limits, only protecting core security interests, avoiding commitments that spread indefinitely. This careful calibration was an expression of the ambivalent state. The U.S. assumed a leadership role, but always calculated whether to withdraw if the costs exceeded its domestic political capacity. The Korean War, the first test, 1950. The Korean War erupted as a challenge. North Korea's crossing of the 38th parallel, with Soviet and Chinese backing, threatened to bankrupt the entire containment doctrine from the outset. The U.S., under the UN flag, intervened. Initially, the goal was to repel the invasion, but then the goal expanded to unifying the peninsula under a pro-Western government. This shift caused the war to spin out of control, leading to direct Chinese intervention. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River, forcing the U.S. to accept a stalemate, a temporary peace. The peninsula remains divided to this day. The Korean War left a dual legacy. On one hand, it proved the U.S. was willing to use force to protect order. On the other hand, it also showed limits that the U.S. could not impose a maximum outcome if the price was all-out conflict with another great power. From here, reluctance became a familiar rhythm. The U.S. pushed forward, but had to retreat to an imperfect equilibrium. Vietnam, when consensus collapsed. If Korea was a test, Vietnam was a tragedy. The U.S. entered Indochina with the belief that if one small nation fell to communism, a domino effect would spread across Asia. However, the deeper it delved, the clearer it became that the war was not just an ideological clash but a political and social quagmire. Hundreds of thousands of American troops poured in, tens of thousands died, but victory did not come. Instead, divisions within the U.S. exploded. Protests, an anti-war movement, loss of trust in government. Vietnam shattered the national consensus that had helped the U.S. maintain its leadership role since 1945. From then on, every decision for military intervention was haunted by the ghost of Vietnam. Nixon and the attempt to rearrange. After the shock of Vietnam, Richard Nixon and I. Kissinger opened another path. Instead of all-out confrontation, they chose triangular diplomacy, reaching out to China to balance the Soviet Union while maintaining U.S. strength through flexible nuclear deterrence. This was an acknowledgement that the U.S. could not bear every burden, everywhere, at all times. It needed the art of diplomacy to share the load. Nixon also left his mark with the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, formally withdrawing troops from Vietnam, but in essence acknowledging failure. Simultaneously, the policy of détente with the Soviet Union showed that the U.S. was willing to turn adversaries into limited partners to maintain stability. This was a blend of pragmatism and idealism, between the desire for global leadership and the fear of getting bogged down. The turning point, from disappointment to rebirth. By the late 1970s, America's image in the world was severely shaken. Defeat in Vietnam, the oil shocks, inflation, and recession, along with the Iranian hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy. All of this created a picture of a superpower adrift. The question hung in the air: was the U.S. entering a trajectory of decline, and would the international order slip from its grasp? But the paradox of American history is that whenever it plunges into crisis, it finds the capacity for rebirth. It was precisely at what seemed to be the most exhausted moment that a new voice emerged: Ronald Reagan. Reagan reasserts American strength. Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981 with a seemingly simple slogan: "Believe in America." What he did was not just policy, but a recreation of national spirit. After a decade of doubt, Reagan asserted that the Soviet Union was not an equal adversary, but an evil empire on the verge of self-collapse. Reagan's strategy was both risky and audacious. Instead of maintaining a fragile balance like Nixon and Carter, he accelerated the arms race, pushing the Soviet Union to exhaustion. Military modernization programs, especially the Strategic Defense Initiative, created immense pressure. But behind the tough rhetoric, Reagan was flexible in diplomacy. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in Moscow, Reagan quickly shifted from confrontation to dialogue. Nuclear arms reduction treaties marked a historical turning point, signaling the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union disintegrated just 2 years later. For many, this was America's moment. For the first time in history, a superpower not only defeated its adversary but stood alone at the pinnacle, without any counterweight. The paradox is that this victory was not the result of a single strategy but a mosaic of reluctant rhythms. The U.S. at times plunged in, at times retreated, at times was rigid, at times conciliatory, at times trusted in absolute power, at times feared entanglement. These very contradictions, instead of destroying, created enough flexibility to adapt to unpredictable events. The consequences of the unipolar moment. After 1991, the United States faced a new question. With no more Soviet Union, where would the order they had created go? Throughout the Cold War, every policy revolved around the goal of containing Moscow. Now, with no adversary, should the U.S. continue to bear the burden of global leadership? In Washington, the answer was divided. One faction believed this was the time to consolidate the global liberal order, expanding NATO, promoting democracy. The other warned that without a counterweight, the U.S. could easily fall into the trap of hubris, getting bogged down in unnecessary interventions. These debates signaled that the cycle of reluctance was far from over. In fact, they became the foundation for later fierce arguments, from the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, to policy towards China in the 21st century. Reluctance, root or identity, asterisk reading through the entire process, one can hardly avoid asking why the United States always wavers between expansion and contraction, between idealism and pragmatism. One answer lies in its political tradition. America was born with the belief that it was a special experiment, a republic of freedom. But at the same time, history also taught them that distant interventions were often dangerous, easily dragging the nation into costly and counterproductive spirals. These two instincts, universalism and caution always, run in parallel, creating the state of reluctance. What is noteworthy is that this very rhythm of reluctance, rather than absolute consistency, is the key to American strength. They know when to retreat to regain consensus, and then advance when the time is right. This is not weakness, but a kind of historical resilience. After the Cold War, entering the unipolar world in 1991 with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the United States unexpectedly faced a situation few could have imagined. For the first time in modern history, a superpower had no global counterweight. This was a unipolar moment, a world where all eyes turned to Washington, both awaiting and suspicious. George H.W. Bush, president at the time, chose to define the new situation with the phrase, "New World Order." In the 1991 Gulf War, the U.S.-led coalition not only expelled Iraq from Kuwait, but also demonstrated overwhelming military power. The sight of precision-guided cruise missiles, the image of tanks rolling across the desert hall, seemed to confirm a reality. No nation could challenge American power. But the paradox quickly emerged. When Saddam Hussein was driven back, Washington decided not to overthrow him. The reason? The U.S. feared getting bogged down, not wanting to entangle itself in complex regional conflicts. Once again, the instinct of reluctance returned. The superpower could defeat its adversary, but hesitated at the prospect of managing the aftermath, humanitarian interventions, and the cost of ideals. The 1990s witnessed a series of humanitarian crises: Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo. Globalized television made images of corpses, refugee camps, and genocide no longer distant. Under public pressure and a belief in America's mission, Washington could not stand idly by. Bill Clinton chose selective intervention. At times, the U.S. participated Bosnia or Kosovo. At times, it abruptly withdrew, as in Somalia after the incident where American soldiers' bodies were dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. Every step forward was accompanied by a retreat, reflecting precisely the rhythm of hesitation. The paradox here: the more the U.S. emphasized universal values, the more it got entangled in endless wars. Behind the moral declarations was a pragmatic question: was the blood of American soldiers worth peace for a distant land? *9/11, a shock that changed trajectory. On September 11, 2001, planes crashing into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon shattered all calculations in an instant. The seemingly unassailable unipolar moment became an illusion. The U.S. no longer had a Soviet-style adversary, but was attacked by a non-state enemy, borderless, ruleless. George W. Bush responded with a new doctrine: preventive war, striking first. Afghanistan became the first battlefield, followed by Iraq in 2003. But unlike the 1991 Gulf War, this time the U.S. decided to go further, overthrowing the regime and rebuilding a new state. The result was a prolonged quagmire. Iraq plunged into chaos. Afghanistan became a swamp for nearly 2 decades. The world's most powerful superpower suddenly found itself helpless against guerrilla warfare and sectarian conflicts that advanced weaponry could not solve. Superpower fatigue. In the early 21st century, the U.S. fell into another spiral, from overconfidence to extreme fatigue. The post-9/11 wars cost trillions of dollars, eroded public trust, and made allies suspicious. Domestically, the 2008 financial crisis further deepened a sense of insecurity. Had America gone too far in its global ambitions? Barack Obama came to power with a promise to withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan while rebalancing towards Asia. But even he could not escape the cycle of reluctance. At times, asserting the U.S. would pivot, at times faltering under the burden in the Middle East. Libya in 2011 is a typical example. The U.S. participated in overthrowing Gaddafi, but failed to prepare for the post-war period, leaving a shattered country. The future: the reluctant superpower enters a new era of competition. Today, as China rises and Russia seeks to reassert its role, the U.S. once again confronts the old question: continue to play the role of order builder or retreat into isolationism? The answer is not yet clear, but history shows one thing: the United States has never followed a straight line. It is precisely this reluctance, with its unexpected twists, that has helped it maintain power longer than any other empire. The paradox, and indeed the hallmark of this superpower, is that each time it seems about to decline, it reinvents itself. Each time it gets bogged down, it finds a way to retreat and return. In this cycle, the world is simultaneously frustrated by and dependent on the U.S. No one else can replace them, but they themselves have never been truly certain of their role. Chapter 9. Technology, Balance, and Human Consciousness. The 20th century left a stubborn paradox. Humanity reached the pinnacle of technical knowledge, but simultaneously unleashed the potential to destroy its own civilization. Nuclear weapons, the ultimate symbol of modern science, transformed international balance from a concept based on traditional military power into a fragile psychological game where the smallest mistake could plunge the entire world into oblivion. In the early stages of the nuclear era, there was still the illusion that atomic weapons were just bigger guns, a new tool to increase power. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki shattered that illusion. This was no longer war in the old sense, but annihilation. The instant death of hundreds of thousands of people in a flash could not be equated with any battlefield disaster known before. The world was forced to accept a harsh truth. For the first time in history, humanity possessed a weapon where even the victor might not survive to enjoy the fruits of victory. From here, the concept of deterrence became the axis of order. No nation could contemplate using nuclear weapons as a tool for victory. Instead, they kept them as a talisman. If you attack me, we both perish. But it is precisely this logic of balance of fear that makes order extremely fragile. There is no longer the simple calculation of troop numbers or artillery, but a mind game among leaders. Will they be sober enough not to press the button? Will signals sent during a crisis be misinterpreted? Just one mistaken warning system, one hasty decision, and all humanity could pay the price. Therefore, nuclear order has never been stable in its essence. It only stands firm thanks to the conscious restraint of those in power. This is a major difference. Previous orders were based on material power. This order hangs precariously on the thread of psychology, of the ability for self-control. Parallel to the logic of global deterrence, the problem of nuclear proliferation further increases risk. When only a few superpowers possessed weapons, there was at least a mechanism for control, dialogue, and agreements. But each time a new nation joins the nuclear club, the balance becomes more complex. Each new trigger is an unpredictable variable. A young, inexperienced leader, an unreliable warning system, a regional conflict blown into a nuclear crisis. Deterrence, already based on fragile restraint, now has to bear the added burden of new players where reason and responsibility are not necessarily steadfast. In this picture, cybertechnology emerges as a new challenge. Unlike nuclear weapons, where a few powers control and the rules are quite clear, cyberspace opens the door for small but devastating actors. An anonymous hacker group could paralyze a national power grid, crash financial markets, or even disable missile warning systems. The cost of causing a global shock in the cyber era is lower than ever. And what is most dangerous is the unknown perpetrator. If a city is wiped out by a nuclear weapon, it's not hard to identify who fired it. But if a nation's power grid is paralyzed, can we be sure it was a state-sponsored attack or just a criminal group? When responsibility cannot be assigned, how can a deterrence mechanism be built? Technology has expanded the scope of power, but also fragmented it. Power, once concentrated in the hands of a few superpowers, is now dispersed into countless needle points. Each point has the potential to tear the fragile fabric of world order, and the paradox is that the more dependent on technology society becomes, the more vulnerable it is. A cyberattack may not kill anyone immediately, but it can erode trust, cause social chaos, and thereby lead to political crisis. Can humanity possess enough consciousness and self-restraint to live in a world where technology always outpaces its instincts and ethics? Balance today is no longer purely about military forces. It demands a new level of consciousness, where leaders are not just strategists, but also courageous enough to say no to immediate reactions, patient enough to wait for time to calm the waves of crisis. It is here that technology and human consciousness collide most fiercely. Technology forces us to decide in milliseconds, while political wisdom requires contemplation, deliberation, and the ability to restrain. That gap between the speed of machines and the rhythm of human breath is the greatest challenge to modern world order. If the nuclear era forced humanity to think about the limits of destruction, the digital era poses a new question. Who is controlling whom? Is humanity controlling technology, or is technology controlling humanity? In the past, war and international order all unfolded in a tangible frame. Armies moved, warships appeared, artillery roared, all sides could observe, predict, and react. But in cyberspace, attacks occur silently, invisibly. A malicious line of code entering a system can lie dormant for months, even years, before delivering a crippling blow. When the consequences appear, the attacker may have vanished without a trace. In that world, the concept of traditional deterrence loses its foundation. How can one deter an enemy whose face is unknown, who has no address? What is more frightening is that cyber technology blurs the line between war and peace. An action that an attacker considers a technical test or cyber espionage can be interpreted by the victim as an act of war. So where is the threshold at which a cyber attack becomes justification for a military retaliation? There are no common standards. Each nation sets its own red lines. And this asymmetry makes the risk of escalation even harder to control. In traditional logic, war, more or less, was based on a calculation of interests. An aggressor had to weigh whether victory was worth the losses. But in cyber warfare, the cost of attack is too low, while the benefits can be immense. This paradox makes cyberspace attractive to forces that cannot compete militarily directly. A small nation, even a non-state group, can destabilize a superpower with a few keystrokes. Order, once based on an asymmetry of power, is now upended by an asymmetry of technology. Not just military, technology also transforms the structure of social power. Previously, the state was the center of information control, from the press to diplomacy. All information flows went through official channels. Today, with social media, any individual can become the spokesperson for a community. A video, a status update, can ignite protests, even shake entire regimes. Soft power, once the prerogative of states and large media corporations, now lies in the hands of millions of ordinary people. From this arises a paradox. The freer information is in a society, the more fragile order becomes. When every voice has a chance to be heard, who will establish common truth, the fundamental element for maintaining social consensus and international relations? If a society cannot agree even on facts, how can it achieve political or strategic consensus? This brings us to a core concept: human consciousness. In the last century, the question was whether humanity had enough reason to restrain the use of nuclear weapons. Today, the question expands. Does humanity have enough clarity to distinguish between truth and falsehood, between information and manipulation, between freedom and chaos? When everything can be recreated, cut, pasted, or simulated by technology, truth is no longer a solid anchor. A society can be manipulated not by bombs, but by sowing doubt in minds. If citizens no longer trust their government, no longer trust elections, no longer trust the media, then national order will crumble from its roots. And if that happens in a superpower, the consequences are not confined to its borders, but spread globally. Therefore, the challenge of the 21st century is not just managing technology, but also nurturing the capacity for consciousness and self-control. Technology can accelerate indefinitely, but if human consciousness does not keep pace, global order will become a car speeding downhill without brakes. We create technology to expand freedom, but technology demands that we cultivate unprecedented self-discipline. Nuclear weapons force superpowers to restrain themselves. The internet forces all of society to be vigilant. And artificial intelligence, looming on the horizon, may force humanity to reconsider its own limits. The link between technological progress and the fragile state of humanity's balance. If nuclear war once forced superpowers to learn to live with fear, digital technology now compels all of society to live with doubt. Fear can be stabilized by deterrence, but doubt cannot. It infiltrates, multiplies, and eventually erodes the foundations of trust. In the nuclear era, balance was based on the principle of mutually assured destruction. Each side knew that if it attacked first, it would also be destroyed. That was a kind of coercive rationality. But in the world of new technology, no similar mechanism exists. Instead of fear, humanity is surrounded by feelings of ambiguity, uncertainty, and sometimes indifference. A hack into the power grid, a disinformation campaign, a series of algorithms amplifying prejudices all can cause serious consequences, yet lack clear deterrence to keep actors within limits. Technology not only changes how we fight, but also how we think about peace. When war has no borders, peace also loses its old definition. It is no longer the absence of armed conflict, but becomes an invisible contest in perception, data, and collective memory. Peace now is the ability to maintain a minimum level of trust in a sea of information noise. Modern technology not only forces nations to confront each other, but also compels humans to confront themselves. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and cognitive enhancement technologies raise the question: if humans can self-modify, enhance, and redefine consciousness itself, then what are the limits of humanity? When minds can be shaped by code and emotions can be manipulated by algorithms, does free will itself, the foundation of all concepts of political order, still exist? A world in which nuclear weapons hold humanity on the brink of destruction, while digital technology pushes humanity to the brink of internal disintegration. At one end, collective fear creates restraint. At the other, fragmentation in individual consciousness erodes that very capacity for restraint. When consciousness is shattered into countless disparate fragments, who will have enough authority to call on all humanity to take a step back? We possess unprecedented powerful technology, but at the same time, common consciousness is more easily swayed, dispersed, and misled than ever before. Once technology surpasses the capacity of consciousness to control it, world order will not collapse due to total war but could disintegrate from within, like a seemingly solid structure that gradually decays from termite infestation. What will keep humanity in balance? Law, deterrence, or the capacity for self-awareness of each individual? There is no definitive answer, but it is clear that when technology becomes an extension of the mind, the prerequisite for any order is no longer just a balance of power, but an internal balance. Because a society may possess advanced weapons, supercomputers, and a global network, but if it lacks the ability to distinguish truth from illusion, lacks the courage to uphold freedom in the face of chaos, then all that technology is merely a double-edged sword, one blade pointing outward, and the other silently turning back on itself.